May 7, 1942. 11:27 a.m. Coral Sea, 350 miles northeast of Australia. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Kakuichi pulled his Aichi D-3A dive bomber into a screaming descent toward the American carrier below. Through his bomb sight, he watched his 550-pound bomb separate cleanly, arc downward, and punch through the flight deck of USS Yorktown at the base of her island superstructure. The explosion sent a fireball 200 feet into the tropical air. Two more bombs followed within minutes, one penetrating to the fourth deck, another igniting aviation fuel stores. Black smoke poured from the wounded carrier. Takahashi circled once, noted the severe list, the fires raging amidships, and radioed his assessment to carrier Zuikaku. Enemy carrier destroyed, sinking confirmed. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but he wouldn't know that for another 28 days. Before we continue with the Yorktown's impossible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to May 7, 1942, where the Yorktown was fighting for survival in waters 2.000 miles from the nearest repair facility. The USS Yorktown, CV-5 in naval designation, was not supposed to be in the Coral Sea that day. She was supposed to be in San Diego, undergoing a routine refit after 4 months of raiding operations across the Pacific. But on April 15th, naval intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio traffic, indicating a massive operation toward Port Moresby, New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be isolated, cut off from American supply lines. The only force that could stop the Japanese advance was a small American carrier task force, and the Yorktown was the most experienced carrier in the Pacific Fleet, so she went south. Into history, into what would become the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval warfare. The battle itself was chaos, both sides fumbling in radio silence, searching for each other across 50,000 square miles of empty ocean. When they finally made contact on May 7th, the violence was sudden and absolute. Japanese dive bombers found Yorktown just after 11 a.m. The ship's air group was away, attacking Japanese carriers 200 miles distant. She was vulnerable. The attacks came in waves, first the dive bombers, then torpedo planes skimming 20 feet above the water. Below decks, in Damage Control Central, Lieutenant Commander John Greenbacker monitored reports flooding in from all sections. 3 bomb hits, 66 men killed instantly, fires on 4 decks. The aviation fuel system ruptured. 1 bomb had penetrated to the 3rd deck and exploded in a rag storage compartment, starting a fire that threatened the forward magazines. The ship's list reached 5 degrees. Speed dropped to 24 knots. For 2 hours, the outcome was uncertain. But the Yorktown's damage control teams were superbly trained. They isolated the fires, counter-flooded to correct the list, and rerouted power systems around damaged sections. By 1:00 p.m., the fires were contained. By 2:00 p.m., she was making 27 knots. By 4:00 p.m., she was recovering aircraft. Takahashi's report of her sinking was premature, but just barely. When Captain Elliot Buckmaster assessed the damage that evening, the numbers were grim. 3 bomb hits had opened holes measuring 8 feet, 12 feet and 15 feet in diameter. The 3rd deck was gutted from frame 110 to frame 120. The aviation fuel system was destroyed. The forward elevator was jammed. Worst of all, structural damage to the flight deck meant she couldn't operate a full air group. Launching aircraft caused dangerous flexing that threatened to split the deck entirely. She could still fight, but she was crippled. The voyage back to Pearl Harbor took 6 days. 6 days of nursing a wounded ship across 500 miles of submarine-infested ocean. The Yorktown's crew worked around the clock, shoring up bulkheads, patching leaks, jury-rigging systems. She made port on May 27th, trailing an oil slick visible for miles, riding low in the water, listing 2 degrees despite all counter-flooding efforts. Dockyard workers stared in disbelief. They'd heard she was damaged. This ship looked like she'd been through a meat grinder. Commander Harold Min Miller was the senior repair officer at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. He'd been repairing ships for 23 years. He knew what was possible and what wasn't. He boarded the Yorktown on the morning of May 27th and spent 6 hours crawling through her damaged sections with a team of engineers. When he emerged, his assessment was blunt. 3 months minimum, maybe longer. 3 months to repair the structural damage. 3 months to rebuild the aviation fuel systems. 3 months to replace the elevator mechanism. 3 months to certify her flight deck for full operations. 3 months the Navy didn't have, because sitting on Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk was another intelligence intercept. The Japanese were planning something massive, an operation targeting Midway Atoll, the tiny speck of Coral 1, 300 miles northwest of Hawaii, that served as the Pacific Fleet's forward outpost. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor would be exposed. The operation was scheduled for June 4th, 8 days away. Nimitz had 2 operational carriers in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet. Against them, the Japanese would bring 4 fleet carriers, the same 4 that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. 2 American carriers against 4 Japanese. The odds were terrible. Unless Nimitz called Miller into his office on the afternoon of May 27th. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Nimitz asked, "Can you make her operational?" Miller replied, "In 3 months, yes, sir." Nimitz said, "You have 3 days." Miller started to protest. Nimitz cut him off. "We need every carrier we have. If she can launch and recover aircraft, she goes. 3 days, Commander. Make it happen." Miller left that office knowing he'd just been handed an impossible order. 3 days to do 3 months of work. 3 days to put a mortally wounded carrier back into fighting trim. 3 days to perform a miracle. But he also left knowing something else. Every man in Pearl Harbor Navy Yard had lost friends on December 7th. Every one of them had stood on the docks and watched the Arizona burn. Every one of them wanted revenge. If Admiral Nimitz said 3 days, they'd give him 3 days, or die trying. Within 2 hours, every available civilian worker in Honolulu had been mobilized. The call went out through union halls, construction sites, machine shops. The Navy needed welders, electricians, pipe fitters, carpenters, riggers, anyone who could hold a tool. The pay was double time, the work was immediate. Over 400 men responded. They arrived at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard in trucks, on bicycles, on foot, carrying their own tools. Most had never been on a military ship. It didn't matter, they had 3 days to save a carrier. The work began at 6:00 p.m. on May 27th. It wouldn't stop for 72 hours. The main challenge was the structural damage. The 3 bomb hits had weakened the flight deck so severely that launching a fully loaded bomber might cause the entire deck to collapse. The repair required removing damaged sections, welding in new steel plates and reinforcing the entire structure with additional support beams. In a normal refit, this work would take 6 weeks. They had 72 hours. Miller organized the workers into 3 shifts working around the clock. But the shifts quickly became meaningless. Men simply worked until they collapsed, slept for a few hours on the dock, then returned to work. The welders were the critical bottleneck. They worked in teams of 4, rotating every hour because the heat inside the ship's damaged sections was unbearable. 120 degrees Fahrenheit, humid, airless. Men emerged from below decks after an hour with their clothes soaked through, hands shaking from exhaustion. The welding had to be perfect. A weak weld could fail under the stress of launching aircraft, causing a catastrophic structural failure that would tear the flight deck apart. Each weld was inspected twice, once by the shift supervisor, once by a Navy quality control officer. Any weld that failed inspection was cut out and redone. There was no time for mistakes. Simultaneously, other teams tackled the aviation fuel system. The bomb damage had ruptured fuel lines throughout the forward section of the ship. Leaking aviation fuel was a floating bomb. One spark could turn the entire carrier into an inferno. The repair crews had to trace every fuel line, test every connection, replace every damaged section. They worked in spaces so confined they had to crawl on their bellies, spaces filled with fuel vapor that made breathing dangerous, spaces where one mistake with a cutting torch could trigger an explosion. They made no mistakes. The forward elevator presented a different challenge. It was jammed half-raised, stuck 6 feet above the hangar deck. Aircraft couldn't pass under it. It couldn't be raised or lowered. The mechanism was damaged beyond quick repair. So they did what any sensible person would do in an insane situation. They welded it in place at flight deck level and declared it a permanent platform. It couldn't move, but aircraft could taxi over it. Problem solved through brute force and ingenuity. On the dock beside the Yorktown, a separate drama was unfolding. The carrier's air group had lost 18 aircraft at Coral Sea, shot down or too damaged to recover. Those aircraft had to be replaced, but there were no spare aircraft. Everything flyable was already assigned to Enterprise or Hornet. The Navy began cannibalizing training squadrons, pulling aircraft from Pearl Harbor's training base, even commandeering planes that had just arrived from the mainland. By May 29th, they'd scraped together 27 aircraft, a mix of F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. The planes were loaded aboard using the crane, since the elevator was inoperative. Each plane was spotted carefully, chained down, fueled. The deck crews worked with frantic precision. Knowing that every hour delayed was an hour the Japanese came closer to Midway. Inside the ship, the transformation was equally dramatic. Damaged crew quarters were stripped to bare metal and rebuilt. The galley, destroyed by a near miss, was reassembled using equipment salvaged from a mothballed destroyer. The radar system, knocked offline by the shock of the bomb hits, was repaired using parts jury-rigged from 2 other radars. The ship's laundry, her post office, her sick bay, all had to be made functional. A carrier wasn't just a floating runway, it was a city of 200 men who needed to eat, sleep, and survive. By the morning of May 30th, 60 hours into the repair, the Yorktown looked like she was dying and being reborn simultaneously. Her flight deck was a maze of welding cables, cut steel plates and exhausted workers. Her interior was torn open, with repair crews working in every compartment. The noise was constant, the hammering of pneumatic tools, the hiss of cutting torches, the clang of steel on steel. The smell was overwhelming. Hot metal, paint, fuel, sweat, coffee, cigarette smoke. Miller himself hadn't slept more than 6 hours in those 60 hours. He moved through the ship constantly, checking progress, solving problems, making impossible decisions. When a welding team reported they couldn't get a proper seal on a fuel line connection because the surrounding structure was too damaged, Miller made the call. Bypass the entire section, reroute the fuel line through an adjacent compartment, accept the reduced fuel capacity. When electricians reported the main power distribution panel was too damaged to repair quickly, Miller ordered them to install a backup panel salvaged from a submarine and run new cables throughout the ship. Every hour brought a new crisis. Every hour, Miller made it work. On the dock, watching the controlled chaos, stood Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would command the Yorktown at Midway. Fletcher had been her captain before the war. He knew every inch of her. Watching her being torn apart and reassembled in real time was like watching surgery on someone he loved. He turned to Nimitz and asked, "Will she hold together?" Nimitz replied, "She has to. We need her." The 72nd hour arrived at 6:00 p.m. on May 30th. By then, the transformation was complete. The flight deck was whole, reinforced with new steel, painted hastily with non-skid coating. The aviation fuel system was operational at 80% capacity, good enough. The forward elevator was welded solid, the radar was functioning, the crew quarters were livable. The galley could feed 200 men. She wasn't pretty, she wasn't perfect, but she could fight. The final test came at 8:00 a.m. on May 31st. A single SBD Dauntless dive bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Sam Adams, would attempt a landing, the first since the Coral Sea battle. If the flight deck couldn't handle the stress of a landing, the entire repair was worthless. Adams brought his bomber in from astern, wheels down, tailhook extended. He caught the number 3 wire at exactly the right spot. The deck flexed, Everyone watching held their breath, then held firm. Adams taxied forward. The deck had held. The Yorktown was operational. At 9:00 a.m. on May 31st, exactly 72 hours after the repairs began, the USS Yorktown cast off from her berth and steamed out of Pearl Harbor. Behind her, on the dock, over 400 civilian workers watched her go. They were covered in grease, sweat, and paint. They were exhausted beyond measure. They had just accomplished something that every engineering manual said was impossible. They'd rebuilt a carrier in 3 days, and none of them would ever be officially recognized for it. The Yorktown joined up with Enterprise and Hornet 300 miles northeast of Midway on June 2nd. The 3 carriers formed Task Force 17, the entire operational carrier strength of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Against them, steaming toward Midway from the northwest, was the Kido Butai, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier striking force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The same 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Between them, they carried 248 aircraft, operated by the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. The Americans had 3 carriers and 233 aircraft, many flown by pilots with less than 200 hours of flight time. The Japanese had sunk 5 Allied carriers in 6 months without losing one of their own. The odds remained terrible, but the Japanese didn't know the Yorktown was there. Their intelligence said she was still under repair in Pearl Harbor, out of action for months. When their scout planes reported American carriers northeast of Midway on the morning of June 4th, Japanese commanders assumed they were facing 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, not 3. That miscalculation would prove catastrophic. The Battle of Midway opened at 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, when a PBY Catalina search plane spotted the Japanese fleet 200 miles northwest of Midway. At 6:00 a.m., Japanese strike aircraft hammered Midway's installations, starting fires visible for 50 miles. At 7:05 a.m., American torpedo bombers from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers and were slaughtered. 15 of 41 aircraft lost without scoring a single hit. The Japanese seemed invincible, but at 7:15 a.m., something happened that would change everything. A Japanese scout plane, launched delayed by mechanical problems, finally radioed a sighting report. Enemy surface force sighted, 10 ships, including what appears to be 1 carrier, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles. 1 carrier. The report said 1 carrier. On board the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced an impossible decision. His strike aircraft were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Bombs for land targets. If there was an American carrier out there, he needed to switch to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for ship targets. But the scout report was vague. 1 carrier. Maybe. The scout pilot wasn't sure. Nagumo hesitated. That hesitation would doom his fleet. At 9:20 a.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet almost simultaneously. Pure coincidence, but catastrophically effective. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Aircraft spotted on deck, fueled, armed, ready to launch. No combat air patrol overhead. The Japanese fighters had been drawn down to sea level, chasing American torpedo bombers. For 5 minutes, the American dive bombers had free rein. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's bombers against Akagi and Kaga. At the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's bombers against Soryu. The Americans dove from 14 Siwa-Zeron feet, undetected until the last moment. The results were devastating. Akagi took 2 bomb hits and was turned into a floating inferno. Kaga took 4 hits and was engulfed in flames. Soryu took 3 hits directly to her hangar deck, igniting fueled aircraft that turned her into a torch. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in 5 minutes. It was the most decisive 5 minutes of the Pacific War. But the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was untouched. She immediately launched a counterattack against the American fleet. At 12:10 p.m., 18 Japanese dive bombers found the Yorktown. The battle was about to come full circle. What happened next was almost incomprehensible to the Japanese pilots. They approached from the south, sun behind them, and saw an American carrier operating normally, Aircraft launching, no visible damage, steaming at high speed. It had to be one of the carriers they'd spotted earlier. They dove to attack. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns opened up, 56 5-inch guns, 24 machine guns. Throwing up a wall of steel, the Japanese dove through it. 3 bombs hit. One struck the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the 4th deck, almost exactly where a bomb had hit at Coral Sea 28 days earlier. The second bomb hit near the island, starting fires. The third bomb was a near miss that ruptured the hull below the waterline. The Yorktown shuddered, listed, and slowed. Black smoke poured from her midsection. Her speed dropped to 6 knots. Captain Buckmaster ordered the crew to prepare to abandon ship. It looked like Coral Sea all over again. It looked like the end. But once again, the damage control teams went to work. They isolated the fires, they counter-flooded, they rerouted power. By 1:40 p.m., 90 minutes after the attack, the Yorktown was making 19 knots. She was damaged but operational. She was recovering aircraft. She was still in the fight. At 2:30 p.m., a second wave of Japanese aircraft found her, torpedo bombers from Hiryu. They came in low, skimming the wave tops, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. The hardest attack to defend against. The Yorktown twisted and turned, but there was no escape. 2 torpedoes struck her port side, opening massive holes below the waterline. The explosions knocked out all power. The list increased to 26 degrees. This time, the damage was too severe. Buckmaster ordered abandon ship at 3:00 p.m. The Japanese pilots returned to Hiryu and reported triumphantly, "Enemy carrier sunk, confirmed." It was the second time Japanese pilots had sunk the Yorktown. But here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. At 3:30 p.m., while the Yorktown's crew was still abandoning ship, another Japanese scout plane spotted an American carrier operating 60 miles east. The pilot radioed back, "Enemy carrier sighted, undamaged, operating aircraft." On board the Japanese carriers, or what remained of them, the report caused confusion. An undamaged carrier. They'd just sunk one carrier 90 minutes ago. They'd confirmed another carrier hit in the morning attack. How were there 3 American carriers? Japanese intelligence had said 2 carriers maximum. 3 was impossible. The carrier the scout had spotted was USS Enterprise. But Japanese commanders, looking at their battle reports, made a critical miscalculation. They assumed they'd hit 3 different American carriers. One in the morning, actually Yorktown, one at 12:10 p.m., Yorktown again, and one at 2:30 p.m., still Yorktown. They believed they were facing 3 carriers when there were only 2 operational, Enterprise and Hornet. The Yorktown, abandoned and dead in the water, was no longer a factor. But the confusion she'd caused affected Japanese tactical decisions for the rest of the battle. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu, launched a final desperate strike at 5:00 p.m., throwing every remaining aircraft at what he thought was a 3rd American carrier. He had to eliminate the American carrier advantage. But his strike was too small. Only 10 aircraft survived the morning's battles, and too late. American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu at 5:05 p.m. and put 4 bombs into her. She joined her sister carriers as a burning wreck. By 6:00 p.m., all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were destroyed or dying. The Japanese had lost because of many factors: bad intelligence, poor tactical decisions, incredible American luck. But one factor nobody talks about is the confusion caused by the Yorktown's resurrection. Japanese commanders believed they were fighting 3 American carriers. That belief caused them to divide their attacks, dilute their striking power, and make tactical errors. They hit the same carrier 3 times over 6 hours and counted it as 3 different carriers. The confusion was understandable. What kind of carrier could survive 3 separate attacks in one day? What kind of crew could damage control their way through that kind of punishment twice? The answer, a crew that had already done it once at Coral Sea. A crew whose ship had been rebuilt in 72 impossible hours by 400 civilian workers who refused to quit. A crew fighting on a carrier that officially shouldn't even be there. The Yorktown didn't sink on June 4th. She should have, dead in the water, listing 26 degrees, abandoned by her crew. But she refused to die. A salvage team reboarded her on June 5th. and found her still afloat, still intact. They began towing her back toward Pearl Harbor. For 36 hours she limped eastward, listing, flooding, but stubborn. The crew began to believe she might actually make it home. But at 1:30 p.m. on June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168 put 2 torpedoes into her port side and 1 into the destroyer Hamon, which was tied alongside providing power. Hamon broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. The Yorktown absorbed the torpedo hits, her 4th, 5th, and 6th of the battle, and still didn't sink. She rolled slowly to port throughout the night of June 6th. At 5:01 a.m. on June 7, 1942, she finally capsized and sank in 300 fathoms of water, taking 141 men with her. She'd survived for 68 hours after being abandoned. She'd taken 6 torpedo hits and 5 bomb hits over 5 days. She'd been declared sunk by Japanese pilots twice, and she'd helped win the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. In the official U.S. Navy history of the Battle of Midway, the Yorktown's role is covered in 3 paragraphs. There's no mention of the 72-hour repair miracle at Pearl Harbor. No mention of Commander Miller. No mention of the 400 civilian workers who performed an impossible task because they were asked to. The credit went to the pilots, rightly so, and to the intelligence officers who broke Japanese codes. But the real secret weapon at Midway was a carrier that shouldn't have been there, operating on jury-rigged repairs, confusing Japanese commanders simply by existing. Commander Harold Miller returned to routine repair work after Midway. He never received a medal for the Yorktown repair. In his fitness reports, his superiors noted he was an excellent repair officer, capable of working under pressure. That was the extent of his recognition. He retired as a captain in 1958 and died in 1972 in San Diego, California, at age 78. His obituary mentioned his 32 years of naval service. It did not mention the Yorktown. Of the 400 civilian workers who rebuilt the Yorktown in 72 hours, none were officially recognized. They went back to their jobs, welding, electrical work, construction. They told stories in bars, at union halls, at family dinners. Most people didn't believe them. Rebuild a carrier in 3 days? Impossible. But they'd been there. They'd done it. They knew. The Yorktown's wreck was discovered in 1998 by a deep-sea expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic. She lies upright on the seafloor, 16,000 feet down, remarkably intact. Her flight deck is still whole, showing the welds that held for exactly long enough. In the photographs from the deep-sea submersible, you can see the repair patches, the jury-rigged reinforcements, the evidence of the desperate 72-hour resurrection. She looks exactly like what she was, a wounded warrior who refused to quit. There's a small memorial to the Yorktown at Pearl Harbor, tucked away near the submarine base. It's a simple plaque listing her battle honors. Coral Sea, Midway. It mentions that she was repaired at Pearl Harbor between battles. It gives no details about the repair. Most visitors walk past without stopping, but the Navy remembers. There have been 2 more ships named Yorktown since 1942, an Essex-class carrier that fought through the rest of World War II, and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser that served until 2004. The name carries weight in naval circles. It means the ship that came back, the ship that wouldn't die, the ship that won Midway simply by being there. The lesson of the Yorktown isn't just about American industrial capability, though that's part of it. It isn't just about damage control, though that's important too. The real lesson is about what happens when you tell good people that the impossible is required. They don't ask if it can be done. They ask how long they have, then they get to work. Miller had 3 days to do 3 months of work. He did it because Admiral Nimitz said it was necessary. The 400 civilian workers worked 72 hours straight because Miller said it was necessary. The Yorktown's crew kept fighting after 3 separate attacks because Captain Buckmaster said it was necessary. At every level, people did impossible things because someone they trusted told them it was required. That's the real story of the Yorktown, not the engineering miracle, though it was miraculous, not the battle damage, though it was tremendous. The real story is about trust, competence, and the human ability to perform beyond normal limits when something truly important is at stake. If this story moved you, If it changed how you think about what's possible when good people are pushed to their limits, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling these stories, the ones that don't make the official histories, the ones about civilians and repair crews and stubborn ships that refuse to die. And drop a comment below. Tell us, what's the most impossible task you've ever been asked to complete? Did you do it? How? We want to hear your stories too. The men who rebuilt the Yorktown in 72 hours are gone now. The last of them died in the early 2000s, but their work remains. In photographs of Midway, in naval histories, in the memory of a carrier that came back from the dead and helped change the course of the Pacific War. They never got medals. They never got recognition. They got to watch their ship sail out of Pearl Harbor on May 31st, 1942, knowing they'd done something nobody thought possible. That was enough for them. It should be enough for us to remember.